Beneath the wide skies of the frontier, where the wind carried both secrets and warnings, the land seemed endless and raw, filled with stories carved into its soil. In that old American setting, when the clash of two worlds was still fresh, there lived a Cheyenne warrior whose path was destined to cross with two young women in a way that neither time nor tradition would allow. The mountains loomed in the distance, sharp and unyielding, while the plains stretched out in golden silence, broken only by the cry of an eagle or the distant drumming of hooves. It was a land where freedom was fought for each day, and yet hearts remained bound by rules no one dared to break. The warrior had lived his life by the teachings of his people, bound to the rhythm of the earth and guided by the spirits of his ancestors. He was strong, respected, and feared by those who knew his name. Yet behind his steady gaze lay a weight, a silence that came not from fear but from a longing he could not name. The world around him was changing. Settlers had come, bringing with them wooden houses, fences that split the open range, and laws written on paper instead of spoken by elders. Among them lived two sisters, whose presence seemed to challenge every boundary the land had drawn between its people. They were unlike the others. While most kept their distance, whispering behind closed doors, these sisters carried curiosity in their eyes. Their days were spent in the hard work of survival. But at night, when the fire softened the shadows, they whispered dreams to each other of a life beyond the fences, beyond the small cabin walls. They were tied by blood and yet different in spirit. One cautious, her thoughts rooted in duty, and the other daring, her heart restless for something untamed. Both, however, carried the same spark that drew the warrior's gaze even when he fought to look away. The settlement where they lived stood at the edge of Cheyenne land, a place where tension always hummed in the air like a bowstring pulled too tight. Peace was fragile, built on unspoken agreements, and every glance between the two worlds carried suspicion. Yet, in that fragile space, fate began to weave its threads. The warrior found himself returning, whether by duty or chance, to the very place where the sisters lived. A word exchanged here, a glance there, and something unspoken began to take root, delicate and forbidden. The nights on the frontier had a way of revealing truths that the daylight kept hidden. Under the blanket of stars, when the land grew quiet, hearts seemed to speak louder. One such night would come to change everything, though none of them knew it yet. That night held the weight of destiny, carrying with it choices that could not be undone. It was not the clash of warriors or the signing of treaties that would shift the course of their lives, but the meeting of three souls bound by something deeper than fear, deeper than law. The warrior carried within him a strength born from generations, but he also bore scars, both seen and unseen. He knew the pain of loss, the silence of battles survived, and the burden of expectations placed on his shoulders. Yet he had never known the kind of pull that made him question his place in the world. When his path brought him near the sisters, it was as though the earth itself tilted. Every rule he had lived by warned him to turn away. Every whisper of the settlement cautioned the sisters to keep their distance. But some forces are stronger than warning or reason. For the sisters, the warrior represented both danger and freedom. He was a reminder of the wild land they were told to fear, but also of the strength and beauty that lay beyond the fences. One sister felt it in the quiet of her heart, an ache she could not name. The other felt it in her restless dreams, a fire that words could not quench. They never spoke of it aloud, not to each other, not to anyone. But in the glances they shared when his shadow passed near, there was an unspoken truth they could not bury. The old world of the Cheyenne and the new world of the settlers were never meant to merge. The cost of crossing that invisible line was heavy. Families could be torn apart, trust shattered, and peace broken in an instant. Yet, as the night that would change their lives drew closer, none of them could stop what was coming. The air itself seemed charged, as if the land knew before they did that a story was about to be written in its soil, one that could never be erased. The warrior had faced many dangers in his life, but this was different. It was not the threat of an enemy's blade or the hunger of winter. It was something quieter, more dangerous, because it reached into the very core of who he was. He stood at a crossroads, one path leading to loyalty and silence, the other to desire and risk. In that silence, the sisters also stood at their own crossroads, torn between duty to their family and the longing that whispered in the dark. That single night, under the weight of the stars, the line between right and forbidden blurred. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what could not be stopped. What began as chance would turn into choice, and what was hidden would no longer stay in the shadows. None of them knew how heavy the cost would be, or how deeply the night would change the warrior's life forever. As dawn approached, the air was thick with the silence before a storm, and the warrior knew there would be no turning back. The sisters knew it too, though they tried to push the thought away. Something had already begun, something that would bind them together in ways no law could allow, and no distance could undo. The world would never look the same after that night. And as the first light touched the horizon, one question remained unanswered. Would the choices made in that forbidden night lead them toward freedom or ruin? The answer waited in the shadows, ready to be revealed but not yet spoken. The story was only beginning, and the land was listening. The morning sun crept slowly over the mountains, painting the sky in pale shades of gold and rose. The light spread across the valley, touching the wooden fences and cabins of the settlement, and stretching further toward the open plains where the Cheyenne still roamed. To anyone else, it was just another day in the long rhythm of survival. To the warrior and the two sisters, however, the dawn carried the weight of something unspoken. Each of them felt it differently, yet none could shake the sense that their lives had crossed into dangerous ground. The sisters went about their chores quietly. Their hands were busy with work, but their thoughts drifted back to the night before, when the world had seemed to shift beneath their feet. One sister tried to bury the memory beneath duty, keeping her eyes low and her movements steady. The other replayed each glance, each moment, as if the silence of the night still lingered in her chest. Their father, stern and tired from years of carving a life from the wild land, noticed nothing. He believed his daughters were safe, protected within the boundaries he had built. But fences could not guard the heart, and rules could not bind what had already begun to stir. The warrior rose with the same sun, though far from the settlement. He moved with the discipline of one who had been taught to greet the day with respect, his mind steady and his body ready for the tasks that awaited him. Yet as he prepared for the morning hunt, his thoughts betrayed him. He had stood in battle, faced storms and hunger, but never had he felt the same pull as when he found his gaze meeting theirs. He told himself it was a danger, a mistake to linger too long, but the memory refused to fade. In the settlement, whispers often traveled faster than the wind. The townsfolk spoke quietly of the Cheyenne camp nearby, sometimes with fear, sometimes with resentment, always with suspicion. To them, the warrior was a reminder of the world they did not understand, a world they wished would stay beyond the hills. Yet the sisters felt something else entirely when they thought of him. It was not fear, though they knew they should be cautious. It was not hatred, though they were told to hold to the ways of their own people. Instead, it was curiosity, an unexplainable sense of recognition, as though his presence filled a silence they had always carried. The days stretched on with the same rhythm, but underneath, the tension grew stronger. The warrior would appear on the edges of the settlement, sometimes with others from his people, sometimes alone, trading or watching with quiet eyes. The sisters found themselves looking for him even when they told themselves not to. It was dangerous to notice, more dangerous still to be noticed in return. And yet the pull was there. Each time his path crossed theirs, a thread was woven tighter into the web of fate that was drawing them together. The older sister, though she fought against her feelings, could not stop the way her heart quickened when his shadow passed. She told herself it was wrong, that her duty was to her family and the life laid out before her. She believed she was strong enough to resist, yet even her steady resolve bent under the weight of longing. The younger sister, bold and restless, embraced what she felt more openly in her own mind, though she hid it from the world. She had always dreamed of something greater than the walls of the settlement. To her, the warrior was the embodiment of the wild freedom she longed for. For the warrior, the struggle was no less fierce. His people had taught him to honor his traditions, to guard the strength of the tribe, to never risk the peace that had been so fragile between their world and the settlers. Yet no matter how he tried to turn away, he found himself drawn back. It was not a choice he made with reason, but a force beyond it. He carried the weight of knowing what it would cost him if others discovered the truth. And still, he could not still his heart. Stories of the frontier often spoke of battles and treaties, of land taken and land defended. But the deeper conflicts were not always fought with weapons. They were fought in silence, in stolen glances, in choices made when no one was watching. The sisters and the warrior lived inside that silence, carrying secrets too dangerous to share. Each day made it harder to pretend, and each night brought dreams that blurred the line between what was forbidden and what was inevitable. Rumors began to stir in the settlement. Some said they had seen the warrior lingering too close. Others whispered that the sisters were not as guarded as they should be. Though nothing had been spoken aloud, suspicion grew. And in a land where trust was already scarce, suspicion was enough to light a fire. The sisters felt the eyes of their neighbors on them, though no words were spoken directly. The warrior felt the watchfulness of his own people, sensing their unease whenever his gaze wandered too far toward the cabins. The land itself seemed to echo their turmoil. The mountains stood unmoving, but the wind carried a restlessness that swept through the valley. The river ran clear, yet beneath its surface currents twisted with unseen force. Everything around them spoke of change, though the shape of that change remained hidden. The older sister grew quieter, retreating into her thoughts. She feared what would happen if the unspoken truth ever came to light. She feared for her family, for the fragile peace that hung between two worlds, for the warrior himself. The younger sister, though afraid in her own way, could not help but feel the thrill of standing at the edge of something unknown. She had always felt caged by the rules of the settlement, and now, for the first time, she felt a door had been left open. For the warrior, every choice weighed heavier. He could not speak of his heart to his people, for they would see it as betrayal. He could not turn to the sisters, for their world would never accept him. And yet, each day drew him closer to the point where silence would no longer be enough. The frontier was a place where lives could change in an instant, where one choice could alter the course of everything. None of them knew when that instant would come, only that it was approaching. The sisters could feel it in their dreams, the warrior in the pounding of his heart when night fell. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in fire, the warrior found himself standing once again near the edge of the settlement. His eyes sought the cabin, though he told himself to look away. Inside, the sisters sat together, their voices hushed, their thoughts heavy. The silence between them was filled with all the words they dared not speak. Outside, the air was thick, charged with something neither wind nor storm could explain. The night that had already changed everything was behind them, but the greater change was still to come. Each step they took, each glance they shared, drew them deeper into a path from which there would be no turning back. The story of a Cheyenne warrior and two forbidden sisters was still unfolding, and its ending had yet to be written. And as the stars began to light the sky, a single question lingered over them all. How much longer could they hold their silence before the world around them forced the truth into the open? The answer waited just beyond the horizon, hidden in the darkness of what was yet to come. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness, like clouds that refused to break into rain. Life in the settlement went on as it always had, with the sound of axes splitting wood, the creak of wagon wheels, and the voices of families calling to one another across the fences. Yet beneath the surface, something unseen stirred. The two sisters moved through their days with quiet determination, but each carried a weight she could not share. The older sister worked harder, keeping her eyes on her hands, pretending her thoughts were not troubled. The younger sister grew restless, stealing glances toward the horizon as though the wide sky held answers. The warrior spent his days among his people, yet his heart was never still. He hunted, trained, and listened to the elders' counsel, but in every quiet moment his thoughts returned to the cabin by the settlement's edge. His people had begun to notice. Questions lingered in their eyes when he returned from long rides near the valley. One elder, sharp and observant, warned him that the balance between their world and the settlers was fragile. One wrong step could shatter what little peace remained. He listened with respect, but deep inside he already knew he was walking that dangerous line. Tension was not limited to hearts alone. Rumors had begun to spread among the settlers. A trader claimed he had seen the warrior watching near the river, and another swore he had glimpsed the sisters speaking with him in hushed tones. Nothing was proven, yet suspicion was enough to set tongues wagging. The settlement was a place where trust was rare, and once doubt took hold, it grew quickly. Their father heard whispers as he worked, though no one dared speak too directly. He grew sterner with his daughters, reminding them of their duty and the dangers that lay beyond the fences. The older sister obeyed in silence, while the younger felt her heart push harder against the rules. The younger sister found her thoughts drifting more often to the warrior. She had always longed for something more than the narrow life her people had carved from the land. The warrior represented not only strength, but a freedom she had never known. She wondered what it might be like to live without fences, to walk beneath the wide sky without fear. Yet she also knew the cost. If anyone discovered the truth, it would not only bring shame, but could endanger the fragile bond between their people. Still, she found herself searching the horizon, waiting for the chance to see him again. The older sister felt the conflict differently. Her heart was troubled by the same pull, but she buried it under duty. She thought of her family, of the expectations laid upon her, of the peace that might be destroyed by even a whisper of betrayal. Yet the harder she tried to bury her feelings, the stronger they seemed to press against her resolve. At night, when the fire dimmed and the house grew quiet, she lay awake listening to the wind, wondering if he was out there beneath the same sky, thinking of her too. The warrior struggled most of all. He was a man bound by his people's ways, yet torn by a desire he could not silence. His heart told him the sisters were more than passing shadows, but his mind reminded him of the cost. His people depended on him for strength, for loyalty. To risk their trust was to risk everything he had been raised to protect. And yet, when he remembered their faces, their voices, he felt something he had never known before, something he could not bring himself to turn away from. The conflict deepened when word came of unrest beyond the valley. A small band of settlers had clashed with a Cheyenne hunting party, and though no lives were lost, the anger it sparked was enough to rattle both sides. In the settlement, men muttered about safety, their voices sharp with fear. In the warriors' camp, younger braves spoke of revenge, restless and hot-blooded. The warrior knew how quickly sparks like these could turn into fire. One wrong step, one rash act, and the fragile peace would crumble. In this growing tension, the bond between the sisters and the warrior became even more dangerous. They knew their meetings could not continue, yet the thought of silence felt unbearable. Each encounter carried more risk, yet also more weight. The younger sister dreamed of escape, of slipping away into the wilderness, though she never dared to speak the thought aloud. The older sister dreamed only of quiet, of finding a way to bury what she felt so that no one would ever know. But their hearts betrayed them each time they crossed his path. A small subplot began to unfold in the settlement. A young man, the son of a farmer, had taken notice of the younger sister. He saw her spirit, her fire, and he mistook her longing for freedom as something he could claim. He spoke of courting her, of building a life together, but his eyes lacked the depth she longed for. She listened politely, but inside she felt only the weight of a choice she could not make. To accept him would mean safety, but it would also mean surrendering the part of her that yearned for something greater. Among the warrior's people, another subplot began. A woman of his tribe, strong and respected, had long watched him with quiet admiration. She believed he would one day lead, and she hoped to stand by his side. She noticed the change in him, the way his eyes drifted toward the valley, the way his silence grew heavier. She did not yet know the cause, but she sensed the danger. Her own heart grew troubled, torn between her feelings for him and her duty to protect the tribe from whatever shadows might be creeping closer. The land itself seemed to mirror the growing conflict. The skies grew restless with sudden storms, the river swelled with heavy rains, and the nights carried a strange stillness, as if the earth itself waited for something to break. The settlement tightened its fences, while the warriors' camp sharpened its weapons. Both sides prepared for dangers they could not name, and yet the true danger was unfolding quietly, in hearts and choices no one could see. The older sister found herself at the center of a different struggle. She began to suspect that her younger sister's feelings for the warrior were stronger than her own. It pained her to admit it, even to herself. She wanted to protect her sister, to shield her from the dangers of such a forbidden bond. But deep inside, she knew she carried the same longing, though she fought harder to hide it. The love they shared for him, unspoken yet undeniable, threatened to turn sister against sister if the truth were ever forced into the light. The warrior, caught between two worlds, knew time was running short. He could not walk both paths forever. His people grew restless, the settlers grew suspicious, and the fragile thread that bound peace between them grew thinner with each passing day. Still, he could not tear himself away. Every glance, every word shared with the sisters deepened the bond that already felt unbreakable. One evening, when the valley lay quiet beneath the fading light, the warrior stood alone at the river's edge. He looked toward the settlement, the faint glow of lamplight flickering in the distance. He knew they were there, the sisters, each carrying the same restless silence that troubled him. The water rushed past at his feet, carrying away leaves and branches, a reminder of how swiftly the world could change. He felt the weight of choice pressing upon him, heavier than any weapon he had ever lifted. The sisters sat in their cabin, the fire casting shadows across the wooden walls. Their father spoke little that night, lost in his own worries about the growing unease between the settlers and the Cheyenne. The sisters exchanged glances in the silence, their thoughts unspoken but heavy. They knew something was coming, something that would test not only their hearts but the fragile balance of everything around them. The story of the warrior and the forbidden sisters was no longer just a quiet secret hidden in the shadows. It was becoming part of a larger storm, one that threatened to sweep across the valley and change all their lives forever. The land was listening, the people were watching, and the night carried the weight of what was yet to come. And as the stars broke through the dark sky, each of them, warrior, sisters, and even those who watched from the edges, felt the same truth. The conflict was no longer only in their hearts. It was spreading outward, weaving itself into the fabric of their worlds, drawing them closer to the moment when silence would no longer hold. The nights grew colder as autumn settled into the valley, and with the change in season came a deeper unrest that neither the settlers nor the Cheyenne could ignore. Fires burned later into the night in both camps, men whispering about dangers, about the fragile thread of peace ready to snap. The sisters felt the tension in the air with every passing day. They heard their father mutter under his breath about raids and stolen livestock, even when there was no proof of who was to blame. They watched the townsfolk's eyes narrow whenever the warrior or his people appeared near the settlement. And still, despite the danger, their hearts betrayed them, pulling them closer toward the one man they were warned to fear. The warrior carried the same burden. He had always been taught to be steady as stone, but the ground beneath him no longer felt firm. Younger braves were growing restless, pressing for action against the settlers. They spoke of honor, of taking back what had been taken, of showing strength. He tried to calm them, reminding them that rash choices could destroy what little balance remained, but he saw the fire in their eyes and knew words alone might not hold them. And then there was the storm within his own chest, the quiet war between loyalty to his people and the forbidden bond that tied him to the sisters. The younger sister found it harder to stay silent. Each day her spirit grew more restless, like a bird trapped behind wooden walls. She knew her father was beginning to notice her distance, though he mistook it for stubbornness. Her suitor, the farmer's son, pressed his interest more openly, speaking to her father about a future, about joining families. She smiled politely when he spoke, but her heart recoiled. Every word he said felt like a chain tightening around her, pulling her away from the only dream that truly mattered. When she thought of the warrior, she felt alive in a way no safe life could give her. The older sister wrestled with her conscience. She told herself each night that her feelings must remain hidden, that her sister's fire was already dangerous enough without her own heart adding to the storm. Yet the silence grew heavier, and she feared that when the truth finally surfaced, it would break them apart. She saw the looks in her younger sister's eyes when the warrior's name was whispered in the air. She recognized the same longing, though shaped differently, burning just as fiercely. It was a bond that drew them together even as it threatened to divide them. The woman in the warrior's camp, the one who had long admired him, began to see the truth forming in the shadows. She noticed his absence at night, the way his thoughts wandered when the elders spoke. She said nothing at first, but her heart grew sharp with both worry and jealousy. She loved her people too deeply to ignore what she saw, and so she began to watch him closely, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect him. One night, the warrior found himself drawn again to the edge of the settlement. The moonlight spilled across the valley, casting long shadows on the cabins and fences. He stood near the river, listening to its steady rush when a faint light caught his eye. Through the small window of the sisters' cabin, he saw them sitting together, their heads close, their faces troubled. Something in his chest ached at the sight, but before he could turn away, a twig snapped behind him. He spun quickly, only to see the younger sister standing near the trees, her breath rising in the cold air. For a long moment they simply stared, neither daring to move. Then slowly she stepped closer. Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the weight of everything left unsaid. She told him she could no longer stand the silence, that each day grew harder with the thought of a life built within walls she did not choose. He listened, torn between the need to protect her and the pull that brought him there in the first place. His answer was quiet, filled with the sorrow of knowing that her words mirrored his own. Neither spoke of love, yet it lingered in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. What they did not know was that eyes were already watching. The farmer's son, frustrated by her distance and driven by jealousy, had followed her into the night. He saw her standing with the warrior, her face lit with a softness she had never given him. Anger burned through him, and though he said nothing then, the seed of betrayal took root. He would not keep their secret for long. In the following days, the tension in the settlement reached a breaking point. Livestock went missing again, and though no one knew who was responsible, the settlers muttered of Cheyenne raids. The whispers grew into louder voices, and talk of forming a group to patrol the valley began to spread. The sisters heard their father speak of it, his jaw set, his tone grim. They knew that if violence broke out, it would not spare the warrior or his people. The older sister could no longer keep silent. She confronted her younger sister one night, her voice sharp with fear. She warned her that their secret would destroy them all, that the bond with the warrior was too dangerous to continue. But the younger sister's fire could not be dimmed so easily. She answered with defiance, saying she would not live a life chosen by others, that her heart belonged to the warrior no matter the cost. The words cut deep, and though they both fell into silence, the bond between them trembled like glass on the edge of breaking. In the warrior's camp, the elders grew wary. Scouts had seen settlers moving in groups, carrying weapons, their faces tense with distrust. The young braves demanded action, insisting they should strike before the settlers did. The warrior argued for patience, for calm, but he felt his influence slipping. He knew that if blood was spilled, the fragile bond between both worlds would shatter, leaving nothing but ruin. And still, even as he fought to hold his people steady, his heart carried the image of the sisters, their faces woven into every choice he made. The woman who watched him grew certain of the truth. One evening she confronted him, her voice heavy with sorrow and anger. She asked if it was true, if his heart had strayed beyond their people. He did not answer, and in his silence she found the truth she feared. She warned him that the path he walked would destroy not only himself, but those he cared for. Her words echoed in his mind, yet they could not loosen the pull that bound him to the forbidden sisters. The valley grew sharper with each passing day. The settlers built their fears into action, gathering weapons, posting guards near the river. The Cheyenne prepared as well, sharpening blades, whispering of vengeance. The sisters felt the world tightening around them, the walls of silence closing in. The younger longed to run, to take the warrior's hand and flee into the wilderness, but the older knew escape would not end the storm. The conflict was no longer just theirs to carry. It had become part of the land itself. The farmer's son, unable to contain his jealousy, finally spoke. He told others of what he had seen by the river, his words laced with bitterness. The whispers spread quickly, reaching the ears of the sister's father. His face hardened as he heard the story, his silence heavier than any shout. That night, he sat across the table from his daughters, his eyes dark, his words few. He asked them if it was true, if they had dishonored their family by crossing into forbidden ground. Neither answered, their silence betraying them more than words ever could. The warrior, too, felt the weight of betrayal drawing near. Scouts brought word of settlers moving closer to their camp, their faces grim, their rifles carried in plain sight. He knew the time for silence was ending. Choices would soon be forced upon them, choices that would shape not only his fate, but the fate of everyone caught in the valley's storm. The nights grew longer, the fires brighter, the tension unbearable. The sisters lay awake in their cabin, unable to find peace. The warrior stood by the river, the moon reflecting in his eyes, his heart torn between two worlds. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. And as the wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the smell of smoke and the sound of distant voices, all three of them knew the moment they had feared was close. The world was moving toward a clash they could not stop. The forbidden bond that had once been their secret was now the heart of a conflict that threatened to consume them all. The story had reached its edge, the point where silence could no longer hold, and every choice would carry the weight of fate. The climax was waiting, just beyond the horizon, ready to shatter the lives of a Cheyenne warrior and the two forbidden sisters who had changed him forever. The night after the storm, the land was quiet again, though not in the same way it had been before. It was a different kind of silence, one that seemed to breathe with relief and sorrow at the same time. The Cheyenne warrior sat by the ashes of the fire, his eyes tracing the faint smoke curling into the sky. The two sisters sat across from him, their hands folded tightly in their laps, as if they feared that letting go would break apart the fragile peace they had just found. Behind them, the cabins stood, some damaged but still standing, proof that the people had survived. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil, reminding them all that life still moved forward even after battles were fought. The warrior knew his life had shifted forever. He had once carried the burden of loss alone, believing his path would never bend from that sorrow. Yet the sisters had opened something within him, something that allowed him to see beyond grief. Their courage had stood beside his own, not as strangers, but as equals who had chosen to fight alongside him when others would have turned away. He glanced at them, and in their faces he saw not just survival, but hope. Still, hope was fragile, and it carried weight. The younger sister looked toward the mountains, her expression thoughtful. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a mix of wonder and fear. She said that perhaps what they had faced was not an end, but a beginning. The elder sister nodded, her hand brushing the younger's as if to steady her. She spoke of how their family had once believed they would never stand side by side with people outside their own blood. Yet now, after what they had endured together, that belief felt small and broken compared to what they had seen. The warrior listened, his heart heavy yet steady. He knew that while the immediate danger had passed, the future would not be without its trials. There were still voices in the settlement that would not welcome him, still doubts and fears that would linger in quiet conversations behind closed doors. And within his own people, questions would rise about why he had chosen to stand so closely with those not of his tribe. These struggles would not vanish overnight. But as he looked at the sisters, he understood that what had been born in that night of fire and storm was stronger than fear. The next days were filled with rebuilding. Men carried wood, women stitched torn cloth, children gathered stones and branches to clear the paths again. The warrior worked alongside them, his hands steady as he lifted beams and hammered new frames into place. Some looked at him with distrust, but others began to see him differently. They saw not an enemy, but a man who had stood between them and destruction. The sisters remained close to him, their presence a shield of its own. The younger often brought water to those who worked, her quiet kindness softening the hard edges of grief. The elder spoke firmly when others questioned why the warrior stayed, her words carrying the truth of what he had done for them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, the warrior walked to the river. The water ran clear, carrying away the ashes of the past days. He knelt and touched the current, feeling its strength. Behind him, the elder sister approached, her steps light on the soil. She asked him if he believed the river could ever forget what had been poured into it. He answered that the river did not forget, but it carried everything forward, making it part of something larger. She seemed to take comfort in his words, her eyes soft as she stood beside him. The younger sister came soon after, her face brightened by the fading light. She carried wildflowers she had gathered, their colors vivid against her simple dress. She placed them on the water, watching as they floated away, drifting toward places unseen. She said the flowers were like promises, carried into the unknown but never lost. The warrior watched the petals sway and turn in the current, and he thought of the path ahead. It would not be simple, but perhaps it was not meant to be. Nights grew calmer, and though the scars of the battle remained, so did the bonds that had been forged. Around the fire, the sisters sometimes told stories of their childhood, laughter breaking through the weight of memory. The warrior listened, sharing his own tales of the plains, of hunts and travels, of lessons taught by wind and earth. Slowly, a new rhythm formed, one that tied them together not by chance but by choice. Yet even as warmth returned, shadows lingered. The settlement elders whispered of boundaries, of lines that should not be crossed. The warrior knew that trust was fragile, that the smallest spark of fear could undo what had been built. But he also knew that fear had already been faced and overcome. He had seen how the sisters stood when the night was darkest, and he believed they would stand again if needed. The final days of autumn drew near, and with them came a sense of turning. The mountains began to frost with white, and the air carried the edge of winter. The warrior thought often of where his path would lead. He had choices now, choices he had not imagined before that fateful night. He could return fully to his people, carrying the memory of what had been shared. Or he could remain close to the sisters, walking a road that would not be easy, but would be filled with meaning. On a quiet morning, he rose before the sun and walked to the ridge above the valley. From there, he saw the cabins below, smoke curling gently from their chimneys. Beyond them stretched the wide land of his ancestors, open and untamed. The sky above was vast, filled with the promise of change. The sisters joined him there, their hair stirred by the wind, their faces turned to the same horizon. They did not speak, yet in their silence was understanding. The warrior felt a stillness in his chest, a calm he had not known since before loss had carved its mark upon him. He realized then that the night with the two forbidden sisters had not just changed his life. It had given him a new life to walk into, a life shaped not by old boundaries but by the courage to cross them. When he returned to the settlement that day, he carried no fear. He carried only the truth of what had been lived. And though whispers would remain, though trials would rise again, he knew the path ahead was one he could face, because he was not alone anymore. The sisters walked beside him, and together they stepped into a future that belonged to them all. The mountain stood tall in witness. The river carried their story forward, and the land, vast and endless, welcomed what was to come. And so it ended not in loss, but in the quiet beginning of something greater, something earned through fire and storm, and sealed in the strength of human hearts that chose to endure together. Top of form, bottom of form.